Before 1978, science officially treated this as somewhere between a fantasy and the occult. One reviewer at a prestigious scientific journal was so unconvinced that a person could be aware of themselves inside their own dream, he simply refused to let the research get published. And yet, the first written mention of this phenomenon is about 2,500 years older than that. Today, we're figuring out when people first learned to realize they were dreaming, while still inside the dream itself. Lucid dreams, moments when you understand you're dreaming while you're still inside the dream, and sometimes can even control it. Science only accepted this as real half a century ago. People knew about it thousands of years earlier. The earliest known written mention of lucid dreaming appears in the Upanishads, sacred Hindu texts created before the year 1000 BC. And in Tibetan Buddhism, an entire spiritual practice was built around this phenomenon for centuries, known as dream yoga. The idea was to stay clearly aware of yourself even while dreaming, using that state as a kind of training ground for spiritual development, a way to understand the illusory nature of reality itself, not just of dreams. So long before psychology existed as a science, entire cultures had already built complex religious and philosophical systems around lucid dreaming. In the West, one of the earliest mentions belongs to Aristotle. Around 350 BC, in his treatise On Dreams, the philosopher described this exact phenomenon, a state in which the sleeping mind somehow understands that what's happening around it isn't real, that it's only a dream. Think about that. The greatest philosopher of antiquity had already described this, and yet science wouldn't accept it as real for another 2,300 years. And here's where the story gets strange. Despite thousands of years of mentions across philosophy, religion, and personal writings around the world, the scientific community simply ignored the topic for centuries. Dreams in general were long considered too subjective, too unscientific for serious laboratory research, let alone the ability to be aware of yourself inside one. The turning point only came in the 20th century, and even then, not right away. In 1975, psychologist Keith Hearne at the University of Hull in England ran an experiment with a well-known lucid dreamer named Alan Worsley. The idea behind the experiment was elegant. Scientists already knew that during REM sleep, the phase with rapid eye movement, the body's muscles are almost completely paralyzed, but the eye muscles stay mobile, which meant that if someone became aware inside a dream, they could, in theory, send a signal, moving their eyes in a prearranged pattern, and that signal could be picked up by instruments while the rest of the body stayed in deep sleep. That's exactly what Hearne recorded, the first laboratory confirmation that the human mind could send a conscious signal from inside a dream. But his research went almost completely unnoticed in mainstream scientific publications. The breakthrough that the whole scientific world actually noticed came a bit later, in 1978, when psychologist Stephen LaBerge at Stanford independently repeated a similar experiment and published the first convincing scientific data on contact between the dreaming mind and the outside world. The method was still built on that same brilliantly simple principle. A volunteer, upon becoming aware inside a dream, would send a prearranged signal with their eyes. Researchers watching the brainwave monitor saw every sign of deep sleep, while the eyes moved in a clearly deliberate, commanded pattern. Later, LaBerge took it even further. Using this same technique, volunteers managed to send more complex messages, for example, counting out seconds while inside a dream, signaling the start and the end of the count. It turned out that lucid dreamers' subjective sense of time inside a dream lined up fairly closely with real time passing while awake. And now, the part of the story worth waiting for. When LaBerge submitted his research to the prestigious journal Science, one reviewer was so unconvinced that lucid awareness during sleep was even possible that he simply rejected the paper. Nature went even further. They didn't take the work seriously enough to review it at all, deciding the topic wasn't of sufficient general interest. In the end, the research was only published in 1980, and not in either of those top journals, but in a far less well-known one. It wasn't until later, thanks to LaBerge's own book and an article in the popular magazine Psychology Today, that the wider public learned scientific proof of lucid dreaming existed at all. Today, the picture looks completely different. According to modern research, about 51% of people have experienced a lucid dream at least once in their life, and roughly 20% experience it regularly, once a month or more. What barely made it past journal reviewers half a century ago is now a well-documented, actively studied phenomenon, complete with its own research labs, methods, and even devices designed to help people enter lucid dreams on purpose. And here's the real paradox of this whole story. Humanity knew about lucid dreaming for thousands of years, and didn't just know about it, but built entire spiritual practices, philosophical treatises, and Tibetan dream yoga around it. Yet science refused to accept that this phenomenon was real until nearly the end of the 20th century. And when the proof finally came, it turned out to be almost laughably simple. It didn't take a complicated device or a revolutionary theory. It just took someone finally thinking to ask a sleeping person, "Can you give us a signal while you're asleep?" And it turned out, yes, they could. Sometimes the longest-running scientific debates aren't settled by a brilliant discovery. They're settled by someone finally thinking to ask a simple question. If you enjoyed this journey into the history of lucid dreaming, subscribe. There are many more topics like this coming. And let me know in the comments, which human habit should I dig into next?